To my dearest friends, I am honored to welcome you back once more for the first part of a new series covering the fabled tyrannic wars, which have irrevocably reshaped and recharted the course of the entire galaxy. We once believed that beyond the light of our most distant stars, out in the inky void of the intergalactic abyss, that space was simply empty, devoid of all consequential matter, and certainly of any motes of life. This, however, is sadly not to be the case. In recent years, we have discovered that past the galaxy's edge, that an alien horror stirs, made up of a swarm so vast that it has entirely blotted out the lights of the unreachable cosmos. Of course, we know these creatures as the Tyrannids, and they are a relentless tide, made up of a truly uncountable sum of lesser monsters, united by the gestalt consciousness of the hive mind. They have drifted through the void for an eternity, just to arrive at the Milky Way when its inhabitants suffer beneath the grinding gears of endless war, with the sole goal of consuming every last trace of biomass to leave our worlds as barren husks, entirely devoid of life. Of all the threats we have thus far encountered, none can be compared to the sheer magnitude of the Tyrannids, and none possess the inherent hunger so insatiable that they may one day devour the very stars themselves. When their kind first probed the worlds of the Imperium, humanity was woefully unprepared for the scale of horror soon to come. And though only a few hundred years have passed since the first major war between our species, they have left an indelible mark and consumed untold thousands of worlds from their relentless feast. Even though there are dozens of hive fleets currently known to exist, we must now turn our attention to the recent past, shifting back to the year 745 of the 41st millennium, when the only hive fleet known to exist was of the beasts named as Behemoth. For this tale, we shall first investigate the mysterious phenomenon which precipitated the arrival of this fleet, before covering its relentless approach into the eastern fringe of our galaxy. Our story will then reach its climax in the invasion of the Ultramar system, where the entirety of the Ultramarines chapter stood firm in the hopes of repelling the beasts during the apocalyptic Battle for Macragge. But I have spoken enough, and so now, my dearest friends, I do believe that it is now time for us to begin. As with all tales involving the Tyrannid menace, we must first start upon the now silent world of Tyran, as we learn of humanity's first encounter with the intergalactic invaders, and of how Hive Fleet Behemoth sparked the first tyrannic war. Out in the farthest reaches of the southeastern fringe, where the light of the Astronomicon barely shines, the distant worlds had slowly been shrouded by an unsettling quiet. Now, this was not unusual by any means, as this frontier realm was only inhabited by some of the more intrepid of souls, who had accepted a life of labor just to pave the way for the Imperium to claim one more world, all for the glory of all mankind. But in places such as these, it is hard to keep tabs on the isolated populations who are ever at risk to the predation of unknown aliens, backwoods mutants, or far-flung heretics. As such, the Administratum controls a series of outposts through the frontier, whose inhabitants are tasked with keeping tabs on the wayward worlds, partly to ensure their populations are safe, but mainly to ensure that their industrial output remains constant. One such world of this kind was known as Tyran, and was operated by a group of the Adeptus Mechanicus who had their own mission, of sending out exploratory teams, hopefully to discover ancient technological relics in these unmolested reaches of the cosmos. But amidst their regular scans, the tech priests quickly noted something quite concerning. A slew of planets under their watch had stopped responding to their regular calls, with some simply going silent, whereas others seemed to have vanished from their star maps entirely, almost as if the systems had been occluded by some great shadow. Sending out their explorator teams, the Mechanicus agents, when arriving in these systems, discovered that the worlds, once lush and vibrant, were now barren husks, entirely devoid of any forms of life. These dead worlds were a mystery, and the priests could scarcely theorize as to what might devastate a planet to such a degree that not even the bacteria nor the fungi could have survived. Returning to Tyran, they submitted their reports, alerting the Imperium to this phenomenon. But their astropathic calls were never received, and their warnings never heeded. Tyran itself was a rather unremarkable oceanic planet, of little use to the Imperium beyond being a manned outpost in the frontier, but that did not mean this world was worthless. Its colossal oceans, far deeper than those once found upon Holy Terra, contained an immensely rich ecosystem, teeming with aquatic life, from the rays basking in the sunlit zones, down to the blind leviathans lurking within the abysso-pelagic depths. But this was of no interest to the priests, who pored over their data, hoping to find some explanation as to why so many worlds had inexplicably fallen to extinction. But if only they had known that the answer to their quandary was fast approaching from the void. The world of Tyran fell in the year 745 of the 41st millennium. They came without warning, appearing within the upper atmosphere just as the warning lights began to signal to the Mechanicus that an alien presence had arrived within their system. None could quite understand how their systems had not detected a fleet so vast that it blotted out the light of their nearby star, but their astropaths blurted out once more that they were within a shadow, and that they could feel an unimaginable entity staring down into their mortal souls. Looking out in disbelief, the priests watched as countless spores crashed into their world, some splashing down into the vast oceans, caught within great waves, but others smashed directly into their outpost, shaking but not quite breaking the foundations. That was not until the pods began to dissolve. The mycetic spores burst open with a great spray of acid, chewing through the ferrocrete bastion, causing it to moan and shudder as the old fortifications buckled and collapsed. They could do little but flee, hoping to get to their escape crafts, but only the priests made it out, as the astropaths had all fallen, clutching at their heads, foaming at the mouth, as the scale of the alien horror was revealed in the depths of their mind. Emerging outside, the Mechanicus personnel saw their scant Skitarii forces devoured beneath a living tide of chittering horrors, spewing out from every angle, covering even the distant landscape in a writhing mass of alien life. Dozens of autocannons and bolter emplacements had been erected in the rare case of an invasion, arranged in overlapping fields of fire. But these were useless, as how can you hope to defeat a force which outnumbers your oldest stores of ammo? Magus Varnak, the senior priest of Mars, who was in charge of the operation upon Tyran, tried as best he could to establish a concentrated defensive protocol around his command bunker. But this was all in vain, all futile against the alien menace. Aerial support vessels crashed down, peppered by venom cannon fire. Mechanicus walkers collapsed as the bioforms chewed through their metallic supports, and the Skitarii were torn asunder, with their scant remaining flesh being ripped out and devoured. Varnac, retreating into his bunker, only managed to hold out for a few more minutes, but it was time that he could use to record the vast amounts of battlefield intelligence collected on these aliens onto a data codex, launched deep into the bedrock to be preserved within an armored bore shaft. But the creatures quickly ripped open his bunker, flooded inside, and without question, this marked the end to the resistance upon Tyran. I should mention at this point that there are rumors regarding Varnac's death. Though by all accounts, he should have been torn limb from limb, we have one source which suggests that he may have been saved at the last moment by the Necron known as Trazin, who preserved the tech priest within his museum upon somnolence. This claim has never been sufficiently substantiated, but it would be quite a treasure to hold the commanding Magos who led the first doomed defense against the Tyranids in all of galactic history. In any event, returning to Tyran, the creatures dragged the bodies of the dead into great feeding pools, melting down their bodies into a constituent soup of biomass, which was then sucked up to the orbiting fleets via a series of immense capillary tubes. The oceans were similarly acidified, with the diverse sea life liquefying into a disgustingly thick mixture, then to be drained and consumed by the hive. In the end, Tyran, once a fertile and ecologically spectacular world, was now reduced to yet another barren rock, entirely devoid of even the faintest trace of life. But at this point, the Imperium had nary the faintest idea that this disaster had occurred. Tyran's final broadcasts had been silenced by the shadow in the warp, and it seemed as though this world would be yet another to have mysteriously fallen amidst the frontier of the southeastern fringe. But the appetite of the great devourer had not yet been quenched, and fate was about to send a lone figure to uncover the truth behind Tyran's mysterious demise. The fall of Tyran was almost entirely unknown to the wider Imperium, though, given its role in monitoring the distant systems, it was only a matter of time before some administratum serf queried as to why they were no longer receiving their regular planetary updates. But in this case, it had become impossible not to acknowledge that Tyran wasn't the only world to disappear from Imperial scanners, and that by this point, several dozen had vanished beneath the mysterious cosmic storm. Speculating that it may have been caused by some alien machinations, the Order Xenos dispatched a Lord Inquisitor to investigate, a figure who had risen to fame during the Macarian heresy, and whose fate would become intimately tied with these alien horrors. Inquisitor Kryptman. With his task force, he made route for Tyran, arriving around a solar year after the station first went dark. He expected to perhaps find evidence of a Xenos pirate raid, or maybe the traces of a malign plague, but instead all he found was silence. The once tempestuous seas were gone, exposing the raw and rocky ocean floors, now stained with a dark and dim mix of greys and muddy browns. The atmosphere was thin and still, and the surface, once lush with volcanic isles and rich flora, was now a barren wasteland stretching out for miles, with not a speck of color to be found. His team, forced to wear rebreathers due to the lack of oxygen, were further puzzled that on closer examination, The arid earth contained nary a trace of bacteria, almost as if the entire biosphere had been sucked up and removed. The Inquisitor and his team wandered through the ruins of the Mechanicus facility, finding only charred fortifications, the half-melted remains of blasted tanks, and the scattered remnants of a battle long past. As expected, there were no survivors. But what was most puzzling was the lack of corpses, or skeletons even. It is a fact that every battlefield will become a graveyard. But here there was simply nothing but rock and ash. Exploring the husk of the old command bunker, Kryptman followed a signal, eventually recovering the data codex left behind as the final parting gift of Magos Varnak. Brushing off the dust, he loaded it into a portable cogitator and finally saw the creatures who brought death to Tyran. The vid-picked images showed chitinous nightmares swarming over the battlefield, of the skies occluded by colossal bioships, and of the Skitarii being butchered and torn asunder by aliens of crimson flesh. As an experienced Inquisitor, he had seen aliens in their every form, but never like this, never so numerous that they moved as a living tide of gnashing teeth and scything talons. Yet they were not aimless. He picked out the larger beasts, watching as they seemed to effortlessly direct the swarm, which then moved as one, like a superorganism, aiming only to feast upon the dead. For but a moment, it was as if Kryptman had seen the future. He foresaw a time where the galaxy would be awash with these monsters, and where every world would fall as Tyran, to be defiled and consumed, leaving the Imperium as a cold and lifeless husk. But as an Inquisitor of the Ordo Xenos, he was sworn to defend all of mankind against the myriad horrors of the alien. And so, realizing the magnitude of this threat, he set about the task of classifying these creatures, as it is only from our understanding that we may hope to slay the alien in all of its nightmarish forms. Given that our first contact was upon the world of Tyran, he named these aliens as the Tyrannids, a name which would soon become known and feared throughout the entirety of the Imperium. Though he attempted to send out an astropathic message with his report, his aides informed him that this system was still muffled by the curious phenomenon of the shadow in the warp, preventing his warning from being heard by the Imperial Lords. Thus, he departed for the Thandros system, as it contained an arcane telepathic matrix, which could boost his astropathic message, hopefully enough to be heard by the wider Imperium. Unfortunately, however, Thandros was also found to be a barren rock, clearly having fallen victim to the Tyrannids, and having suffered the same fate as Tyran. Nevertheless, he was starting to understand that the aliens only seemed to consume biological matter, and that inert materials or electronics were generally avoided, meaning that the Matrix, though battered by the invasion, was left in a usable state. Repairing the device, he managed to get into contact with the Inquisition, who grimly assessed his report before instructing him to make route to the realm of Ultramar and to inform the nearby Ultramarines that their system was in the direct course of this alien horror. Thus, Kryptman once again departed, with the navigators charting a course directly to Macragge, homeworld to the Ultramarines and jewel of Segmentum Ultima. On his voyage, the Inquisitor, in keeping with ancient tradition, deemed that this Tyrannid swarm should be given a name befitting of the ancient beasts which stalked the stories of old Terran myth, and the codified title for this first of the Hive fleets became Behemoth. Hive fleet Behemoth's advance through the southeastern fringe brought with it a path of cosmic destruction and a level of death perhaps never before seen in this region of the galaxy. Hundreds of star systems, once home to vibrant civilizations, were harvested and stripped bare, with every last trace of biomass being subsumed to feed the relentless hunger of the Hive. Though the modern-day Tyrannids are rather infamous for using subversive tactics or striking with a nightmarish sense of subtlety, Behemoth, at this point, was far more crude and brutal. Its bioforms would charge in as an unrelenting tide, crashing against whatever foe they encountered, throwing as many lesser creatures against the doomed defenders as was necessary to finally see them crumble. Indeed, it seemed as though the Tyrannids sought to drown their prey in a sea of gaunts, which greatly contrasts a more modern hive like Jormungandr, which was known to use tunneling beasts to neutralize the heavily fortified defenses of many imperial worlds. Still, with every planet snuffed out beneath the Behemoth, the Hive fleet was only growing more bloated with biomass, allowing the hive mind to produce larger swarms and more powerful bioforms, soon to be unleashed within the fertile realm of Ultramar. But the Imperials were not the only victims to fall to the newly catalogued hive, as the Tyrannids saw all life, no matter how civilized, as their prey. Behemoth, barreling through the stars, eventually arrived within a system infested not by humans, but by the galaxy's other prolific warmongers, the Orcs. The Jagger system had been claimed by a freebooter warband named as the Star Crumpers, who, to the uninitiated, are green-skinned pirates, infamous for raiding Imperial supply lines, stealing away great hordes of booty and slaves. But their mighty armada of kill cruisers, though effective against Imperial traders, were found to be woefully inadequate when faced off against a bloated hive fleet. The Orc captain, delighted to have found a proper fight, hurled his entire armada at the intruding swarm, with hundreds of crude warships careening into the now infested void. Unfortunately, however, each and every ship of his fleet was torn open, boarded, and consumed by waves of the Tyrannid bioforms. The Orcs inflicted no consequential damage to the Behemoth, and in the end, the scrap fortress upon Jagger was invaded and destroyed, leaving little more than a quiescent sphere of rock and the echo of the last Wah, forever choked in Xeno's tendrils. As the swarm pressed on, Kryptman followed from a safe distance as best he could, collecting data and noting the fate of each world. He saw as a minor tendril unfurled from the fleet, only to ensnare the abandoned planet of Sibari, which, unbeknownst to the Imperium, fostered an isolated stronghold inhabited by a renegade chapter of the Space Marines known as the Death Shadows. They had fallen from grace along with 29 other chapters during the Abyssal Crusade, and had posted up within this system so as to one day attack the Ultramarines, though this plan was violently cut short, as the entire world was swallowed up and devoured by the fleets of Behemoth. Quite interestingly, as Kryptman noted, the swarm was seen to protrude out with two minor tendrils, brushing against the ancient world of Solemnus, a planet already recorded by the Imperium as being devoid of all life. This, however, was not entirely accurate, as life did in fact stir beneath the crust, though it was not the conventional form of biological life that scanners could easily detect. This planet was a tomb world, ruled over by Trazyn the Infinite, Necron overlord to the Nihilak dynasty, and home to his museum of oddities and treasures sourced from the entire stretch of galactic history. Of course, Kryptman had no idea of what lay beneath the surface, and so it surprised him to see the tendrils recoil and avoid the world. But it led him to hypothesize that the beasts were perhaps more intelligent than he had previously thought. If they had indeed avoided the planet due to its apparent lack of surface biomass, then it would suggest that they were not simply a species of mindless beasts, and that perhaps they were planning their invasions with a true sinister sense of intelligence. But, moving on, the fleet eventually arrived upon a maiden world known as Shao-Yor, treasured by the Eldari to such an extent that the craft world of Biel-Tan had sworn to defend it from any hostile incursion. Through ancient webway portals, they deployed the super-heavy engines of Vol, which are enormous grav tanks capable of felling Imperial Titans. But these were unable to repel the endless swarms, eventually forcing the Star Children to pull back and abandon the maiden world. In the aftermath, Shao-Yor's forests were consumed, and its spirit shrines dissolved within the Tyrannid feeding pools, culminating in the death of the world spirit and the loss of countless exodite souls. And so it was that in a matter of months, HIVE fleet Behemoth had cut a bloody swathe through the southeastern fringe, with nary a world being able to mount a substantive defense, nor even leave a meaningful scar upon the great fleet. By this point, it had grown to such a prodigious scale that it would have been visible on a map of the entire galaxy as a relentlessly charging spear jutting into the Imperium, aiming towards its very heart. Yet now, all this effort had driven it into a feeding frenzy, and it required the continuous feasting of ever greater sources of biomass in order to sustain its colossal size. Thus, the only place left with enough biological matter to entice it was of the heavily defended realm of Ultramar, home to the Ultramarines, who had been steadily fortifying their worlds for the final battle fought between man and Tyrannid. This climactic showdown would prove to be one of the most pivotal of campaigns in Imperial history. With a potential victory set to halt the alien menace, but a defeat would almost surely spell the doom of the entire segmenta. Forewarned by Inquisitor Kryptman's harrowing reports, the Ultramarines had been graced with the precious time needed to prepare themselves for the coming storm. Chapter Master Marneus Calgar, a strategic genius and paragon of the Codex Astartes, understood that the Tyrannids would cleave through the outer worlds of Ultramar, but that in order to halt their approach, that they must be stopped dead in their tracks upon their home world of Macragge. The planet, being at the center of the realm of Ultramar, was already a heavily fortified bastion. But the Marines wasted no time in assembling further reinforcements and constructing a greater series of defenses. Every available ship of the Ultramarines fleet was mustered in orbit, whilst dozens of vessels from the Imperial Navy were summoned with each passing day. Strike cruisers and battle barges hung in low orbit, their guns bristling, while Macragge's formidable orbital defense platforms powered up their macro cannons, missile silos, and stellar torpedo bays. They were further strengthened by a ragtag armada of merchants, privateers, and pirates who had escaped from the clutches of the Behemoth, yet had no purpose left other than to fight to the bitter end. On the surface, billions of citizens were evacuated to safe zones, though those of ample skill were conscripted into the Ultramar Auxilia and dispersed around the growing fortresses, forming battle groups, layered defensive lines, and vast kill zones. The Marines themselves had assembled every available battle brother for the coming campaign, culminating in what was perhaps the largest single assemblage of Ultramarines seen since Guilliman first divided the old legions into their smaller chapters. The titanic god engines of Legio Praetor were positioned to defend critical locations, whilst the renowned Freeblade, known as Auric Arachnus, joined the Imperials, his bright yellow armor sure to attract the attention of the coming swarm. But so it was, that only a short few weeks after Kryptman had arrived, that the void sensors upon Macragge began to fade, revealing a growing tide of psychic darkness, encircling the realm of Ultramar and blocking off the Ultramarines from the wider galaxy. The Behemoth had finally arrived. Calgar, commanding the fleet, gave the order, and the Imperial Armada surged forward to meet the Tyrannids head-on in a cataclysmic void war, determined to blunt the attack as best they could before it inevitably reached Macragge. What followed was truly horrific, with the Tyrannid bioships coming in waves, hurling themselves at the human fleet with an animalistic ferocity, caring not for their own survival and only for the destruction of their feeble prey. Though the battle fleet was truly prodigious, they could hardly contend with this foe, bloated from the biomass of several hundred fertile worlds. Every wave that fell was simply replaced by another, containing larger, faster, and more vicious vessels, driven into a frenzy at the taste of blood in the void. Their disgusting bioships would clamp onto the ancient battle barges, cleaving them open betwixt great jaws, whilst mycetic spores filled the surrounding system, further occluding the Imperial sensory systems, who had never faced a fleet so numerous. In the end, the orbital platforms lay in ruins, and hundreds of vessels had been lost, forcing the surviving battle fleet to perform a tactical retreat and to regroup in a safer region of space, lest they lose every one of their treasured craft. This, however, left Macragge ripe for the taking. Calgar had prepared his forces to defend a series of key locations across the world, with the polar fortresses in the north and south being the final bastions should the bulk of the planet fall. These polar monasteries were the strongest redoubts of the Ultramarines, housing vast armories, generators, and the chapter's most secure gene seed reserves stored deep beneath the frigid ice. The entirety of the first company, comprised of 100 Terminators, stood ready at the polar fortresses alongside supportive formations of the PDF, the chapter serfs, and of the numerous automated defences. The remaining companies were split between two task forces, with Calgar leading the largest on the field, taking command of the entirety of the second company, along with supportive elements of the 5th and of the scouts from the 10th. But then it all began. The sun dimmed as the HIVE fleet surrounded Macragge, and like a grotesque rain, it vomited forth a slew of mycetic spores, hurtling down across every surface of the doomed world. Attacking the vanguard was perhaps the only opportunity the Marines had to gain the upper hand, and so they struck hard and fast at the encroaching Tyrannids. This tactic was surprisingly effective, with the varied forces being able to temporarily slow the living tide by encircling them and attacking from multiple angles, forcing the swarm to break apart into an uncoordinated mess, negating the usually brutal offensives which had come to define this hive. Unfortunately, however, this success could not last, as the Tyrannids simply dropped more and more of the lesser bioforms down, quickly overwhelming the Marines and devastating large portions of the PDF. They also launched a rather uncharacteristic strategy, in that the Hive fleet activated a clutch of gene stealers, which are infiltrative bioforms, who crawled out from beneath the Sirocco starport and slaughtered the defenders from within. This was quite a pivotal strike, as it deprived the Imperials of this region from resupplying or evacuating if the situation became too dire. And indeed, it only took a few more weeks until the entirety of the Reach was overrun and consumed by the aliens. This loss precipitated the fall of the equatorial stretches of Macragge, essentially splitting the world in two, defended now by the primary fortifications upon the north and south poles. Pulling back into the north, the Ultramarines led by Calgar had taken up their posts within the industrial zone of the Cold Steel Ridge, which had been hastily fitted with a slew of defensive fortifications and was supported by a Baneblade, known as the Pride of Hera. This complex was the final remaining defensible post to be found before reaching the permanently frozen North Seas, and if it fell, there would be no place left to hold before the Tyrannids inevitably reached the polar bastion and claimed this world for the Hive. Thus, the ridge would be held by any means necessary, and the Ultramarines would stand and die if necessary, so as to halt the relentless path of the Behemoth. Their ultimate goal here was simply to delay the swarm, and to buy enough time for the First Company within the polar region to complete their defenses, lest they be caught entirely unprepared for the coming waves. Billions of bioforms had been amassed into a living tide, charging directly up through the world, culminating in a spear-headed formation aimed directly at the frozen ridge. They were further bolstered by the ever-raining spores, which burst open on impact, revealing claw-limbed hormagaunts and hulking carnifexes charging out, whilst the slavering gene-stealers and lithe lictors dropped low, half burying themselves in the snow, as they stalked the outskirts to find any vulnerable openings to attack. The Ultramarines, however, on Calgar's word, opened fire with their well-drilled precision. Bolter and plasma fire screamed through the frigid air, scything down chitinous fiends by the thousands, whilst predator tanks and thunderfire cannons entrenched along the ridge unleashed torrents of shells exploding amid the storm, throwing ichor and alien limbs skyward. The pristine snow was stained a sickly mix of purple and red from the Tyrannid blood, whilst the ice began to melt from the sheer heat given off from the battle, causing some bioforms to crash through weaker areas and drown within the icy seas below. By this point, Behemoth had only been in the galaxy for an extraordinarily short time, with some sources claiming that Macragge was besieged in the same solar year as of when Tyran had fallen. Nevertheless, in that time, the Hive had already begun to rapidly evolve to the myriad dangers of the Milky Way, producing new bioforms, which were to be found dotted throughout the unending swarm of lesser gaunts. The most notable and impressive of these creatures, however, would be of the monstrous beast known as the Swarm Lord. This was a unique variant of the commonly encountered Hive tyrants, formed to hold the closest link to the Gestalt hive mind, whilst also being able to recall the tactics of every foe fought by the Great Hive. As a result of this, it was constantly learning and adapting towards the strategies of the Ultramarines, to the point where it was able to counter the tactical ploys of the Astartes, rendering their defenses as rather ineffective. Rather than advancing as a single tide, the Tyrannids instead would strike in several coordinated waves from different directions, luring out the Marines before encircling and devouring them. This was certainly the case when a clutch of Raveners assaulted the left flank of the industrial complex, forcing the Ultramarines to redirect some of their brothers, but in the newly exposed front, a group of Carnifexes charged forward and fell upon the prized Baneblade, the pride of Hera. With crushing claws, they tore open its hull like a can of rationed meat, allowing a Ripper swarm to dive within and devour the terrified yet succulent crew. Each time Calgar adjusted his defense, the Swarm Lord seemed to have anticipated his move and already produced a counter. Fairly quickly, the Chapter Master realized that this beast was targeting him, focusing its alien mind on his own, and that it knew he was the linchpin to the Imperial armies. Indeed, this assessment was quickly proven true, as with a blood-chilling roar, the Swarm Lord stepped forward into the icy fray and directly challenged Calgar across the chaos of war. Without waiting for a response, it charged through the bloody snow with a truly horrifying sense of alacrity, deftly avoiding the living tide of gaunts below, which parted like the waves of an ocean, revealing the great fin of a shark on the hunt. A ferocious duel between the two commanders erupted, with Calgar's master-crafted power fists striking with the force of a thunderbolt, capable of shattering lesser Tyrannids into a slurry, yet against this great beast he was simply outmatched and was unable to land any effective blows, quickly forcing him back on the defensive. With its 4 bone swords, the Tyrant Lord whirled and slashed out like a blizzard, striking Calgar again and again, until with a final blow it plunged one of its blades through his ancient armor, lifting the Chapter Master off of the ground before hurling him aside like a broken doll. Seeing this, the Honor Guard rushed forward, but were dragged down into the bloody snow by a litter of Hormagaunts, who had been feigning their own death, yet were sparked back into action by a psychic command of the Swarm Lord. Nevertheless, the veterans were able to fight through, taking up the shattered body of their commander to a low-flying Thunderhawk gunship, evacuating him to relative safety at the cost of sacrificing themselves to the swarm. Aloysius, captain of the Honor Guard, was slain in single combat by the Swarm Lord, though without his intervention, the beast would surely have killed the Chapter Master, and so his sacrifice forever earned him a place within the Ultramarines' Hall of Heroes. But with this, the Cold Steel Ridge fell to the Tyrannids, and by this point, hundreds of the Ultramarines had died, half buried beneath the snow, and the alien dead. There was nothing left to stop their advance, and so the Tyrannids charged forward across the frozen ocean, rapidly closing in on the final remaining bastions of the northern and southern poles. In high orbit, Calgar had rapidly recovered from his devastating wounds, and though still battered from the fight, he took up his post of command and began to reorder the desperate defense of Ultramar. Rather tragically by this point, the orbital fleet had lost all contact with the polar fortresses below, and by all accounts, the Marines believed that they had failed in their mission, and that Macragge had been entirely overrun by the invasive swarm. Nevertheless, this was no time for resignations, as the Marines still held the remnants of their fleet, which had found a surprising degree of success in the second phase of the Void War. It seemed as though the invasion of Ultramar had exhausted the fleet of much of their biomass, forcing the Hive to pull back, as it could no longer replenish its heavy losses. Thus, the Predator became the prey, as Calgar ordered for the Armada to pursue the Tyrannids into the abyss, finally forcing them into a battle around the ringed world of Circe. Here, a second Tyrannid fleet was lying in wait, vastly outnumbering the Imperials. But this was all to count for nothing, with the daring sacrifice of the Emperor-class battleship, known as the Dominus Astra. Though a priceless artifact of the dark age of technology, the vessel powered up its engines, plunged directly into the heart of Hive Fleet Behemoth, and detonated its warp drives, exploding out in a colossal void of unreality, sucking the Tyrannid fleet into the Immaterium, and annihilating them in one fell swoop. With this single act, the Hive fleet was almost entirely destroyed, with the remaining Imperials being able to mop up any surviving dregs, which flailed about as an uncoordinated and crippled beast. Returning to Macragge, Calgar led the first wave to discover the fate of his world, first landing within the silent fortress of the Northern Pole. As the Marines moved through the frozen wastes, they found naught but the scenes of a terrible battle, with the bastion utterly littered with the bodies of Marines and Tyrannids alike. Most tragically, as he entered into the inner sanctum, he found that the entirety of the First Company had sacrificed themselves to the last, giving their lives to repel the swarm, before they could reach the precious gene seed of the chapter. Similarly grim findings were reported within the southern fortress, where all of its defenders had been slain, yet had held fast against the faltering tide. Truly, this could be nothing more than a Pyrrhic victory. Yes, they had defeated Hive Fleet Behemoth, and yes, they had prevented the Tyrannids from devouring a vast swathe of Segmentum Ultima. But all this had been at the cost of the Ultramarines themselves, whose numbers would not be fully replenished for many years to come. While the battle for Macragge marked the end of the First Tyrannic War, it did not mark the end of Hive Fleet Behemoth, nor of the Tyrannid threat in its entirety. In the aftermath of the conflict, Imperial xenobiologists and military commanders sifted through the wreckage and blood-soaked remains, trying to piece together some cohesive knowledge on the Tyrannid species. At the time, it was believed that with the death of the Behemoth, that this extragalactic invader was entirely destroyed. Yet in the not-so-distant future, the Imperium would be forced to contend with several more Hive fleets invading through the galactic rim to devour the stars from within. The preceding fleets, primarily being of the Kraken and the Leviathan, would each adapt their tactics and bioforms so as to avoid the pitfalls of the Behemoth and to generally become more efficient predators against the species of the galaxy. But still, the myriad bioforms recorded from Behemoth were studied and catalogued, providing the Imperium with an impressive repertoire of specimens to examine, allowing them to codify a series of strategies which proved to be most useful for the future invasions. Inquisitor Kryptman, the man who named this species, would go on to become the galaxy's leading expert on the Tyrannid menace, formulating a series of radical ideas on how to slow an encroaching Hive fleet by purposefully destroying Imperial worlds so as to deprive the aliens of their precious biomass. But in the wake of the Behemoth, he would leave to work with the agents of the Death Watch, assisting them in producing the famed Hellfire rounds, which are a form of ammunition for bolt guns containing a vial of mutagenic acid capable of melting down tyrannid flesh in an astonishing speed. Calgar remained as the chapter master to the Ultramarines and oversaw the reconstruction of his chapter, with some estimates claiming that they lost over 3/4 of their battle brothers during the deadly war. It would not be until the year 861 of the 41st millennium, a full 116 years after the conflict, that the chapter was replenished to its full roster of 1,000 Marines. One figure, the venerable chaplain known as Ortan Cassius, had been forever changed by the war after he fell during the fighting, being torn apart by a rampaging carnifex, which carved most of the flesh from his body, forcing him to be rebuilt by the apothecaries as a man entirely covered by scars. Still, he would go on to form a brotherhood within the Ultramarines known as the Tyrannic War Veterans, consisting of the most elite of survivors to have fought upon the surface of Macragge and lived to tell of their tale. As it so stands today, around half of the First Company is now made up of these veterans, and they have become rather famous throughout the Imperium as being some of the most vengeful hunters of the Tyrannids, matching the skill set and tenacity of the veteran Death Watch. But when it came to Behemoth itself, though the fleet had been shattered, it was still a deadly beast, and it would go on to remain as a malign stain upon the southeastern fringe, never to be fully expunged. The HIVE split off into many splinter fleets, diverging quite wildly from one another, with different color patterns, tactics, and unique bioforms manifesting throughout the shattered hives. The Swarm Lord of the Cold Steel Ridge was officially reported as being destroyed, yet the body was never recovered. And in truth, it is more likely that the tyrant was dissolved and subsumed back into the hive, as it would go on to reappear in the future, becoming more deadly and more intelligent with each appearance. Upon the world of Calth, where the Tyrannids had been repelled, reports began to surface of a one-eyed carnifex, frozen deep within a great block of ice, which prompted a series of fools to defrost the creature, hoping to claim the bounty for its corpse. Unfortunately, however, the carnifex was anything but dead, and the beast, now named as Old One-Eye, charged out, carving a great swathe of destruction and havoc in its wake. It has since been recorded as having appeared in thousands of battles throughout the southeastern fringe, possibly suggesting that the hive mind has replicated the bioform as one of its finest creations. But nevertheless, for the few decades after Macragge, there was a deceptive lull in Tyrannid activity throughout the galaxy. Quite interestingly, the Imperium was entirely ignorant to the creatures of Hive Fleet Tiamat, which had actually arrived within the galaxy several millennia earlier than Behemoth, but had simply remained in a dormant state within their own secluded star system. But it would not be until the waning years of the 41st millennium when the Kraken appeared in the galactic east, bringing with it the dawning horror that the Tyrannid menace was not dead, and that the tyrannic wars were only just beginning. But with this, my dearest friends, I do believe that we have now come to our end. Thank you all so much for listening to this tale on the Hive Fleet of Behemoth and of the First Tyrannic War in its entirety, and I do hope that you enjoyed this retelling. For now, however, I must close this chapter once more and leave you for another week. And so, as I go, I will wish each and every one of you with a very warm goodbye.